The morning sunlight reflected off the harbor, scattering glimmers of gold across the rippling water. Claire pulled her sweater tighter around herself as she waited on the dock, her gaze flicking between the glistening hulls of the yachts moored nearby. She'd always thought yachts were for people who didn't know what to do with their money, floating palaces of indulgence. Now, standing on the cusp of their world, she couldn't deny her curiosity. This wasn't where Claire had imagined she'd spend her summer. She had other plans, taking extra courses to get ahead in her economics program, applying for internships at reputable firms, and maybe, just maybe, finding a sliver of time to relax. But life had other ideas. Her mother's health had taken a turn in the spring, forcing her to take on more shifts at the diner to help cover the mounting bills. When tuition notices arrived in her inbox, she knew the diner wages wouldn't be enough. The yacht job had come through a friend of a friend, an opportunity passed along in whispers, the kind you didn't question too hard if you needed the money. It paid well, almost suspiciously well, for a temporary cleaning gig. And while the thought of scrubbing floors and polishing railings wasn't exactly appealing, it was better than returning to the diner for another round of doubles. Claire's family wasn't the kind to ask for help. Her mother had raised her and her younger brother, Sam, on a single income, working tirelessly to provide for them after her father's death when Claire was 7. Growing up, Claire learned early how to stretch a dollar and fend for herself. She inherited her mother's work ethic, but also her stubborn independence, which meant that when things got tough, she rarely told anyone just how much she was struggling. The sound of a car door slamming snapped her out of her thoughts. A sleek black sedan pulled away from the dock, leaving behind a group of sharply dressed men. They were flanked by assistants carrying briefcases and laptops, their presence exuding an air of authority and wealth. Claire straightened her posture, gripping the handle of her cleaning supplies bucket. Her boss, a wiry man named Derek, called her over. "Claire, you're on deck duty today," he said brusquely, barely looking at her. "Keep everything spotless, and stay out of their way. They're here for business, not chit-chat." "Yes, sir," she replied, suppressing the urge to roll her eyes. She understood the rules. Clean, blend into the background, and act like you don't hear a word of what's said. The yacht, aptly named Solstice, was a marvel of engineering and excess. Polished wood, gleaming chrome, and glass surfaces stretched in every direction, reflecting the azure sky above. Claire had never been aboard something so extravagant. Even the air seemed different, cooler, scented faintly with ocean salt and the citrusy tang of luxury cleaning products. As she got to work wiping down the deck furniture, the men filtered inside, their voices carrying through the open doors. Claire wasn't trying to listen, really, she wasn't, but their conversation was impossible to ignore. "I'm telling you, if we don't close this merger by the end of the quarter, the board will have our heads," one of them said, his tone sharp and clipped. Another voice, lower and more deliberate, replied, "The board isn't the problem. The problem is that our competitors already know our position. They'll undercut us if we don't move first." Claire frowned as she adjusted the placement of a deck chair. Their words piqued her curiosity. She didn't understand all the details, but as an economics student, she recognized the weight of their discussion. It wasn't just small talk. This was high-stakes corporate maneuvering, the kind of strategy she read about in textbooks. A man stepped onto the deck, his phone pressed to his ear. He was tall, with perfectly styled hair and a suit that fit as though it had been made for him, and it probably had. His movements were quick and precise, each step radiating confidence. Claire couldn't help but notice how everyone seemed to defer to him, their tones softening, their laughter quieting whenever he spoke. "Donovan," one of the other men called from inside the cabin, "can you remind the team why we're not entertaining the lower offer?" Donovan ended his call with a sharp click, tucking his phone into his pocket. "Because the lower offer," he said, stepping back inside, "is an insult to our intelligence. They're fishing for a weak spot, and we're not giving them one." His voice was like a knife, sharp, commanding, impossible to ignore. It sent a shiver down Claire's spine, though she wasn't sure if it was admiration or unease. As the conversation inside resumed, Claire forced herself to focus on her work. She moved methodically, wiping down every surface, her hands working faster than her thoughts. But the voices inside kept pulling her attention back. "They'll fold under pressure," Donovan was saying. "They always do. We just need to apply the right leverage." "And if they don't?" another voice asked. Donovan's laugh was low and confident. "Then we make them regret it." Claire paused, her cloth hovering over the glass railing. There was something magnetic about the way Donovan spoke, the way he seemed so sure of himself. But there was also something unsettling, an arrogance that reminded her of the men who had tried to stiff her tips at the diner, their smugness thinly veiled by charm. She shook her head and turned back to her task. This wasn't her world, and it never would be. These men, with their tailored suits and high-stakes deals, didn't know what it was like to worry about making rent or keeping the lights on. They didn't know the satisfaction of earning something the hard way, of pushing through when every obstacle seemed insurmountable. Still, as she scrubbed the railings and polished the fixtures, Claire couldn't help but feel a flicker of curiosity. The intricacies of their conversation, the strategy, the risks, the rewards, it was the kind of challenge she loved. It reminded her of why she'd chosen economics in the first place, why she spent late nights poring over case studies and running numbers until her eyes blurred. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the men inside grew louder, their discussion punctuated by bursts of laughter and the occasional sharp remark. Claire kept her head down, her hands moving in steady rhythm, but her mind was anything but still. "Donovan, for God's sake, let it go," one of the voices rang out, sharp with exasperation. Claire glanced toward the open cabin door, her curiosity piqued despite herself. "Let it go? I'm sorry, were you not paying attention during the last meeting? We're on the brink of a disaster, and you're suggesting I let it go?" The reply came from a man whose tone was all edge and authority. His voice had a particular cadence to it, as though he expected every word he spoke to be taken as gospel. Claire bit her lip, resisting the urge to peek inside. She recognized the dynamics at play even without seeing their faces. It was a power game, one where every word was a chess move. The merger they were discussing sounded important, something about international markets, a hostile takeover. She didn't understand all of it, but she caught enough fragments to piece together the stakes. It was fascinating, in a way that surprised her. Numbers and deals weren't new to her, she was an economics major, after all. But there was something about the real-world urgency of their conversation that stirred her curiosity. The sharp sound of a chair scraping against the floor startled her, and she snapped her attention back to her task. She was suddenly hyper-aware of her own presence, of the uniform she wore and the bucket by her side. She didn't belong here, not in this world of tailored suits and high-stakes negotiations. And yet, she couldn't stop herself from listening. The man with the sharp voice, Donovan, she assumed, stepped onto the deck, a phone pressed to his ear. He was tall, with a self-assured stride and an expression that seemed perpetually unimpressed. His presence was magnetic in a way that bordered on intimidating, as though he carried an invisible force field that demanded attention. Claire kept her head down, scrubbing a particularly stubborn spot on the table in front of her. She could feel his gaze on her, a brief flicker of acknowledgement that was neither kind nor unkind, merely a passing judgment. He said something into his phone, his tone clipped, before turning back toward the cabin. She wondered what it was like to live in a world where you could speak to others like that and still be admired. Respected, even. It was a strange kind of power, one that fascinated and repelled her in equal measure. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting golden hues across the water, Claire finished her tasks and gathered her supplies. The conversations on the yacht continued, their intensity undiminished by the passing hours. She stole one last glance toward the cabin before stepping off the deck, her mind buzzing with thoughts she couldn't quite articulate. Donovan adjusted the cuffs of his tailored shirt as he stepped into the expansive cabin of the Solstice, his sharp eyes scanning the room. Everything was just as he'd expected, polished, opulent, and designed to impress. He moved through the space with the kind of practiced ease that came from years of cultivating an image, a man who always seemed to know exactly where he belonged. This weekend wasn't just a retreat, it was a stage. Donovan had worked too hard and come too far to let a single moment slip by without reinforcing his position. Joining Wexler and Company, one of the most prestigious consulting firms in the country, had been a dream he'd nurtured since his early days at a modest state college. He wasn't born into privilege, and he didn't have a family name to carry him. What he did have was ambition, and he wielded it like a sword, cutting through every obstacle that stood in his way. It had been 6 years since he first walked into the marble halls of Wexler as a junior associate, green but hungry. The long nights, grueling projects, and relentless competition had shaped him, molding him into someone who not only survived the corporate grind but thrived in it. Promotions came quickly, first to senior associate, then to team leader, and now, with this merger, he was standing on the precipice of something bigger. Donovan took a glass of champagne from a passing server, letting the bubbles fizz against his tongue. The merger was more than a deal to him, it was a proving ground. Leading the negotiations had solidified his role as a rising star within the firm, and this weekend on the yacht was his chance to cement that perception. He didn't just want respect from his peers, he wanted awe. He had always been conscious of how he presented himself. Whether it was the cut of his suits, the precision of his words, or the way he held a room, Donovan knew that power wasn't just about results, it was about perception. He was acutely aware of the whispers that followed him through the office, the ones that called him arrogant, relentless, unyielding. He didn't mind. Let them whisper. Donovan didn't need to be liked, he needed to win. In his personal life, Donovan's ambition left little room for anything serious. Relationships were distractions, complications he couldn't afford. He enjoyed companionship, of course. His phone was full of numbers from women who appreciated his charm and the easy confidence he exuded. But none of them lasted longer than a few months, and none of them ever got close enough to demand more of him than he was willing to give. This focus, this singular drive, was what set him apart. And it was why, as he stepped into the main cabin to join his colleagues, he felt no hesitation about asserting himself. The men gathered around the table were formidable in their own right, executives and senior partners with years of experience, but Donovan had earned his place among them. Donovan, one of the older men, Charles, greeted him with a nod. "Good to see you. We were just discussing the revised projections for the merger. What's your take?" Donovan set his champagne glass down with deliberate precision and took the seat at the head of the table. "My take," he began, his voice smooth but commanding, "is that the projections don't matter if we don't act decisively. The other side is stalling because they're testing our resolve. They're looking for cracks. We need to make it clear that there aren't any." Charles raised an eyebrow, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "And how do you suggest we do that?" "By outmaneuvering them at every turn," Donovan replied, leaning forward slightly. "We've already identified their weak points. We need to exploit them. Hesitation only gives them more time to regroup." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Then, slowly, the men began to nod. Donovan allowed himself a small smile. It wasn't just about being right, it was about being the one everyone looked to for direction. As the evening progressed, Donovan moved seamlessly through the group, engaging in sharp debates and exchanging pointed remarks with his peers. He thrived on the tension, the way each conversation felt like a strategic game. Even the moments of laughter were calculated, the camaraderie carefully balanced with subtle assertions of dominance. He noticed how the others deferred to him, how they turned to him for validation or waited for his approval before committing to a stance. It was exactly what he wanted, what he had worked for, to be the center of gravity in any room he entered. Donovan's life was a symphony of precision and dominance, with every note carefully composed to project control. He moved through the world with a self-assured stride, his tailored suits and expensive watches symbols of the power he had worked so meticulously to acquire. To most, he was the epitome of success, the youngest executive in his firm's history, a name whispered in reverent tones at boardroom tables. What they didn't see, or perhaps chose to ignore, was the way his charm came with a razor's edge. He wielded his charisma like a weapon, capable of cutting down anyone who dared challenge him. Flattery was a tool, and insults were ammunition. For Donovan, the world was a battlefield, and he intended to win every skirmish. He thrived on the thrill of competition, the rush that came with crushing a rival in negotiations or watching an adversary falter under pressure. It wasn't enough to succeed, others had to fail, and preferably in ways that underscored his superiority. He told himself it was strategy, not cruelty, though even he wasn't always sure where the line was. But there was something else, too, something quieter and more fragile that he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. It whispered to him in the moments between victories, a nagging sense of dissatisfaction that no amount of success seemed to erase. He ignored it, drowning it out with the applause of his peers and the clink of champagne glasses. This weekend on the yacht was supposed to be another conquest, a chance to solidify his dominance within the firm by leading the charge on the merger. The stakes were high, the kind of deal that could make or break careers. Donovan relished the pressure, the way it heightened his senses and sharpened his instincts. The late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the yacht's deck as the conversation in the cabin reached a crescendo. Donovan leaned back in his chair, one arm draped over its back, the picture of calculated arrogance. His tone carried the sharpness of a blade as he dissected the flaws in the merger proposal, commanding the attention of the room. He was in his element, relishing the authority he wielded over his audience. Claire was outside, polishing the glass railing. She could hear every word through the open door, the rhythm of the discussion drawing her in despite herself. It wasn't just the subject matter that intrigued her, though that alone would have been enough. It was the personalities at play, the dynamics of power and strategy unfolding like a chess match. She found herself captivated by the sheer audacity of Donovan's confidence, even as she bristled at his dismissive tone. When the discussion turned to a specific aspect of the deal, a loophole in the contract language, Donovan's voice rang out, dripping with derision. "It's a textbook example of incompetence. Honestly, I don't know why we're wasting time debating this when the solution is obvious." Claire couldn't help the small, involuntary snort that escaped her. It wasn't loud, but in the relative quiet that followed Donovan's declaration, it was enough to catch his attention. His head turned sharply, his gaze narrowing as it landed on her. "You find something amusing?" he asked, his voice laced with sarcasm. The other men in the room followed his gaze, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Claire froze, her heart hammering. Every instinct screamed at her to apologize and retreat, but something stopped her. Perhaps it was the lingering irritation at his tone, or perhaps it was the knowledge that she wasn't wrong. Either way, she straightened her spine and met his gaze. "I just think there's more to it than that," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. Donovan raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening. "Oh, do you? Please, enlighten us. What does the cleaner think we've missed?" The room erupted into low chuckles, and Donovan leaned forward, clearly expecting her to falter. But Claire didn't. She took a deep breath and began to speak, outlining her thoughts on the contract's wording and the potential ripple effects of the loophole. Her analysis was clear, concise, and undeniably insightful. As she spoke, the laughter in the room faded, replaced by an almost palpable tension. When she finished, there was a beat of silence. Then, one of the older men, a graying executive with an air of authority, nodded slowly. "She's right," he said, his voice thoughtful. "That's a perspective we hadn't considered." The shift in the room was immediate. Several heads turned toward Donovan, whose expression had hardened. The smirk was gone, replaced by a tightness around his mouth that suggested he wasn't used to being outmaneuvered, least of all by someone he considered beneath him. "Well," he said after a long pause, his tone clipped. "Thank you for that unique perspective." The laughter was loud and unrelenting, rolling across the cabin like waves against the hull of the yacht. It wasn't just amusement, it was a collective, unspoken acknowledgement that Donovan's attempt to belittle Claire had backfired spectacularly. His face tightened, but he quickly masked it with a tight, performative smile. He leaned back in his chair, feigning indifference, and waved a hand as if to dismiss the whole incident. "Well, there you have it," he said, his tone light but forced. "The cleaner solves the problem. Maybe we should put her on the payroll." A few scattered chuckles followed, but they lacked the genuine humor of the first round. Donovan's attempt to regain control had fallen flat, and the room sensed it. Claire didn't respond, instead returning to her work as if the exchange had never happened. Her measured indifference cut deeper than any retort could have. She wasn't smug, wasn't gloating, she simply acted as though his words carried no weight. It was a stark contrast to the power Donovan usually wielded in rooms like this. For the first time in years, he wasn't the one dictating the tone. As the discussion moved on, Donovan found himself uncharacteristically quiet. He should have been focused on the details of the merger, but his mind kept drifting back to the sting of her words and the laughter that had followed. It wasn't just the embarrassment that got to him, it was the realization that she hadn't needed to try. Her intelligence had spoken for itself, cutting through his bravado like a scalpel. And for a man who had built his identity around always being the smartest person in the room, the wound felt deeper than he cared to admit. Donovan was seething. He couldn't stop replaying the moment in his head, the way the room had turned against him, the look of quiet confidence on Claire's face as she dismantled his argument. It wasn't just embarrassing, it was infuriating. And yet, beneath the anger, there was something else. Something he didn't want to acknowledge. She had been right. For the rest of the evening, Donovan found his thoughts straying back to the incident. He told himself it didn't matter, that she didn't matter. But the words felt hollow, even to him. The yacht's opulent dining room was quiet, the hum of the engine faint beneath the polished floor. The evening had stretched long, the earlier tension still lingering in the air. Donovan nursed a glass of whiskey, its amber depths reflecting the dim light. His pride had taken a hit, and the sting of it refused to fade. Across the room, Mr. Harrison, his boss and the chairman of the firm, sat in a leather armchair, his sharp gaze fixed on Donovan. "That was quite the show earlier," Harrison began, his tone deceptively mild. Donovan glanced up, his jaw tightening. "I handled it." "Did you?" Harrison leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Because from where I was sitting, it looked like you let your arrogance get the better of you." Donovan bristled, his grip tightening around the glass. "With respect, sir, I wasn't aware we were giving the cleaning staff seats at the table." Harrison's eyes narrowed. "And that attitude, Donovan, is precisely why we're having this conversation. You're brilliant, no one's denying that. But brilliance doesn't excuse arrogance. It doesn't excuse dismissing people because they don't fit your narrow definition of relevance." Donovan opened his mouth to retort but stopped when he saw the steel in Harrison's gaze. The older man had a reputation for his unflinching honesty, and in this moment, it was clear he wasn't pulling punches. "Do you know what makes a great leader?" Harrison continued. "It's not just intelligence or strategy. It's the ability to listen. To recognize that good ideas can come from anyone, anywhere. You had an opportunity today to show humility, to acknowledge insight when it was given. Instead, you doubled down on belittling someone who outsmarted you." Donovan flinched, the words landing like blows. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but he couldn't deny the truth in Harrison's assessment. Harrison leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady and thoughtful. "Donovan, I've seen this pattern before. Right now, your results speak for themselves, and I won't deny you've brought significant wins to the company. But as responsibilities grow, so do expectations, not just of your performance, but of your leadership. If you want to move higher, if you want to take on greater roles, your behavior has to reflect the kind of leader this company needs. And I'll tell you now, it's not the sharpest knife that leads the pack, it's the one who knows how to wield it wisely. Donovan crossed his arms, leaning slightly forward, his voice firm. With respect, sir, I've delivered results, consistently. I close deals, I drive profits, and I keep this company moving forward. Isn't that what matters most at the end of the day? Harrison's expression didn't waver. He let a beat pass before responding, his voice calm but resolute. Results matter, yes. But I've seen too many great performers crumble when they're asked to lead bigger teams, manage higher stakes, and embody the company's values. They stumble not because they lack talent but because they fail to keep their teams unified, motivated, and ultimately, happy. A team that doesn't trust its leader doesn't perform long-term. And Donovan, no one climbs alone forever. Not even you. I'm not saying this to tear you down, Harrison said, his tone softening slightly. I'm saying it because you have potential. But potential means nothing if you can't learn to respect the people around you. The room fell silent, the weight of Harrison's words settling between them. Donovan stared into his glass, the fiery liquid blurring under his gaze. He hated the way the conversation had stripped away his defenses, leaving him raw and exposed. But more than that, he hated the realization that Harrison was right. The humiliation of the afternoon replayed in his mind, Claire's calm voice cutting through the room, the way she had dismantled his argument with such quiet confidence. He had underestimated her, dismissed her, and in doing so, had made a fool of himself. For a man who prided himself on control, the realization was a bitter pill to swallow. That night, long after Harrison had retired to his cabin, Donovan stood on the deck, the cool breeze biting against his skin. The stars above were sharp and clear, their light cutting through the inky blackness. He gripped the railing, his thoughts a tangle of frustration and introspection. He had built his career on being the smartest person in the room, the one with all the answers. But today had shown him the limits of that approach. He had always viewed humility as a weakness, a trait for those too timid to assert their authority. But now, he couldn't shake the feeling that it might be something more. The idea unsettled him. He had spent years constructing a version of himself that was untouchable, invulnerable. To question that now felt like dismantling the foundation of everything he had achieved. And yet, he couldn't ignore the growing awareness that something needed to change. As the hours wore on, Donovan remained on the deck, the weight of the day pressing heavily on him. The stars above offered no answers, only the quiet insistence of their light. For the first time in a long time, Donovan allowed himself to wonder if the path he was on was the right one. It was a question without an easy answer, but it was a start. The Monday morning buzz of the office was as relentless as ever, with the hum of printers and the clatter of keyboards filling the air. Donovan strode through the marble-floored lobby, his posture rigid, his jaw set. The weekend on the yacht had left him with a storm of thoughts, ones he wasn't eager to confront. He told himself he'd compartmentalize, as he always did. Work didn't allow time for personal distractions, especially not ones that threatened the unyielding facade he'd built over the years. When he entered the executive suite, however, it became clear that compartmentalization wouldn't come easy. Mr. Harrison was waiting for him, leaning against the doorway to the conference room, a stack of papers in his hand. He handed them to Donovan without a word, his expression unreadable. A casual glance revealed the agenda for the week, performance reviews, quarterly projections, and, of course, the merger negotiations. But what stood out most was Harrison's silence. It wasn't reprimanding, it was expectant, as though waiting for Donovan to prove something. Donovan took the hint. He spent the morning preparing for a team meeting, poring over reports and revisiting decisions he'd once made with unchecked confidence. When he finally entered the boardroom, the familiar faces of his department greeted him. There were glances, subtle but noticeable, exchanged between team members. It didn't take much to realize that they, too, had heard whispers of the yacht incident. He cleared his throat. Let's get started. For the first 20 minutes, the meeting unfolded as it always did. Donovan drove the discussion, firing off questions and critiques, steering the agenda with practiced ease. But then, as they reached the third item on the list, a delayed project with no clear solution, he hesitated. Normally, he'd assert his opinion, dictating the path forward with the kind of authority that left no room for dissent. But something about Harrison's words from the weekend lingered in his mind. Instead of speaking, Donovan leaned back in his chair and scanned the room. "What are your thoughts?" he asked, his voice measured. The question hung in the air like an alien presence. A few team members exchanged wary glances, unsure if this was a trap. Finally, a junior analyst named Rebecca spoke up, outlining a solution she'd been developing. Her voice was tentative at first, but as she explained the details, her confidence grew. By the time she finished, the room was nodding in agreement. "Good idea," Donovan said, and to his own surprise, he meant it. "Let's run with it." The look of surprise on Rebecca's face was brief but unmistakable. For a moment, Donovan felt a flicker of something he hadn't anticipated: satisfaction. It wasn't the usual satisfaction of asserting his dominance or securing a victory. It was quieter, more subdued, the kind that came from knowing he'd given someone else a chance to shine. As the days turned into weeks, small changes began to accumulate. Donovan started asking more questions in meetings, inviting feedback instead of dictating terms. He made an effort to acknowledge contributions, offering words of encouragement or a simple, "thank you," where previously there had been silence. The shifts were subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but they didn't go unnoticed. In the break room, employees whispered about the new Donovan, their tones a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Some speculated it was a strategic move, a ploy to curry favor with Harrison or position himself for a promotion. Others wondered if the change was genuine. Donovan didn't concern himself with their theories. He wasn't entirely sure of the answer himself. What he couldn't ignore, however, was the impact. Team morale began to improve, as did productivity. Projects that had stalled suddenly gained momentum. Meetings were no longer dominated by his voice alone but had become collaborative efforts. He found himself listening more and talking less, and to his surprise, he didn't hate it. Late one evening, Donovan sat in his office, the city skyline glowing through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was reviewing the week's reports when a realization struck him. He hadn't consciously intended to change his behavior, it had just happened. Or, rather, it had started happening the moment Claire had spoken up on the yacht. He frowned at the thought, conflicted. It wasn't just the embarrassment of being called out that lingered. It was the way she had done it, with quiet confidence, without malice or arrogance. She had made her point and walked away, leaving him to wrestle with the implications. And wrestle he had. Now, sitting alone in his office, Donovan couldn't deny the truth. Claire had been a catalyst, whether she'd intended to be or not. And while he wasn't ready to admit it to anyone else, he could admit it to himself. For the first time in his career, Donovan began to wonder if power wasn't about dominance or control. Maybe it was about something deeper, something that couldn't be measured in stock prices or quarterly profits. The thought unsettled him. But it also intrigued him. As the clock ticked past midnight, Donovan leaned back in his chair, staring out at the city lights. Change, he realized, wasn't always a grand gesture or a sweeping declaration. Sometimes, it was a series of small, almost imperceptible steps. Steps that, when taken together, could lead somewhere entirely new. Performance review day had always been Donovan's favorite. For most executives, it was a perfunctory exercise, an obligation to check boxes and issue polite platitudes. For Donovan, it was a chance to remind his team who was in charge. He relished the opportunity to set the tone, to keep his employees on their toes. But this year, the day felt different. As he sat at his desk, the list of names in front of him, he found himself less focused on critique and more curious about what his team might say. He wasn't sure when the shift had happened, but he suspected it had something to do with Harrison's words, and the quiet ripple effect they had set in motion. The first few meetings were uneventful, with employees dutifully recounting their accomplishments and goals. Donovan nodded along, offering occasional feedback, though he felt a growing sense of restlessness. Then Rebecca stepped into the room, her usual nervous energy noticeably subdued. "You've been doing good work," Donovan said after she finished outlining her progress on the delayed project she'd revived weeks earlier. "That idea you brought up during the meeting, it was the right call. I've seen the results." Rebecca blinked, as though she hadn't expected him to acknowledge it. "Thank you," she said, her voice tentative. "That means a lot." He nodded, glancing down at her evaluation form. There was a moment of silence, and then Rebecca cleared her throat. "Actually," she said, "I wanted to say something about you." Donovan's gaze flicked up, his eyebrows raised. "Go on." "It's just, things have felt different around here lately. In a good way. I think people feel like they're being heard more. And I just wanted to say, thank you for that. I think it's made a real difference." Donovan was momentarily at a loss for words. He had expected to hear about metrics, deadlines, and team goals, not this. He managed a nod, though the weight of her words lingered long after she left the room. By the end of the day, a pattern had emerged. Employee after employee had echoed Rebecca's sentiments, describing the changes they'd noticed in his behavior. It wasn't effusive praise, his team was too professional for that, but it was genuine. For the first time in his career, Donovan felt as though he was seeing his colleagues not as tools or assets but as people. It was an unsettling realization, and yet it carried a strange sense of satisfaction. That evening, Donovan returned to his office and sat in the quiet, the glow of the city lights casting long shadows across the walls. He thought about the team's feedback, about the subtle changes he'd made and their unexpected impact. The next morning, Donovan was summoned to Harrison's office. He entered with his usual confidence, but there was a subtle undercurrent of curiosity. Harrison was reviewing a document when Donovan stepped inside, gesturing for him to sit. "Donovan," he began, his tone neutral but carrying weight, "I've completed my review of your team's performance over the last quarter. Their productivity metrics are significantly higher than before, and their feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. Whatever you've been doing, it's working." Donovan blinked, caught off guard by the praise. Harrison continued, leaning forward slightly. "I'll be honest, I wasn't sure if you had it in you to adjust. But you've proven me wrong, and I respect that. Because of these results, the company is awarding you a bonus for improved team performance. Congratulations." He handed Donovan an envelope, his expression one of measured approval. Later that evening, Donovan sat alone in his apartment, the unopened envelope on the table beside him. He should have felt elation, pride in the validation of his efforts. But instead, his mind kept circling back to that day on the yacht, the laughter that had stung, the sharp clarity of Claire's words, and the way it had ignited a shift he hadn't fully understood until now. If she hadn't spoken up, if she hadn't quietly put him in his place, would any of this have happened? The thought nagged at him, filling him with a strange mix of gratitude and regret. She'd been the catalyst, and he'd never even thanked her. After a celebratory dinner with a few close friends, Donovan returned home, the city lights twinkling through his window. As he sat in the quiet, sipping a final glass of wine, the solution came to him. He couldn't change the past, but he could acknowledge it. He could find her, reach out in some way that reflected how much her actions had impacted him. Grabbing his laptop, he began searching for the yacht company's contact information, determination sparking in his eyes. Donovan sat at his desk, his phone pressed against his ear as he stared out at the city skyline. The hum of the call's hold music droned on, filling the silence of his office. He wasn't exactly sure what he planned to do once he got through to someone at the yacht company. In fact, he hadn't been sure of much since the idea first took root in his mind. All he knew was that he couldn't ignore the feeling that had been gnawing at him for weeks, the need to do something. Finally, a clipped, professional voice answered. North Star Yacht Rentals, this is Maria. How can I assist you today? Donovan cleared his throat, his words measured but deliberate. Hello, Maria. I'm trying to track down one of your temporary staff members. She worked aboard the Solstice earlier this summer. A cleaner. Her name was Claire. There was a pause on the other end. I'm afraid we can't disclose personal information about our employees or contractors, sir. Company policy. Donovan had expected this, but he pressed on, his tone softening. I understand, and I respect your policies. I'm not asking for anything invasive, just a way to thank her. She made a meaningful impact during that job, and I'd like to express my appreciation. Perhaps you could pass along a message? Maria hesitated, the sound of papers shuffling faint in the background. I wish I could help you directly, but we don't maintain long-term contact with our seasonal workers. Most of them are students, and Claire, I believe, mentioned attending college. That might be a starting point, if you're determined. Donovan's pulse quickened. Did she say which college? I believe it was Hamilton University, Maria said after a pause. But again, I can't confirm anything further. Thank you, Donovan replied, jotting the name down quickly. He ended the call, staring at the piece of paper in front of him. Hamilton University. It wasn't much, but it was something. The next morning, he dialed the university's main line, explaining that he wanted to inquire about one of their students. He didn't mention the yacht or the specifics of their encounter, only that he'd like to support her in some way. The operator transferred him to the bursar's office, where he was greeted by a cheerful woman named Eleanor. She's a bright young woman, Eleanor said after Donovan provided Claire's name. A third-year economics major, I believe. I'm afraid I can't share personal details, but I can tell you that she's on a payment plan for tuition and often works extra hours to make ends meet. Donovan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Payment plans. Extra hours. He pictured Claire on that yacht, polishing railings and scrubbing surfaces while the rest of the world discussed multi-million-dollar mergers. She hadn't just been working a summer job, she'd been fighting for her future. Eleanor's voice broke through his thoughts. If you're interested in helping, we do accept tuition payments from third parties. It's not uncommon for students to receive support from anonymous donors. Donovan didn't hesitate. How do I go about arranging that? Within the hour, the arrangements were made. Donovan had paid Claire's tuition for the upcoming year in full, ensuring she wouldn't have to worry about a single installment. He insisted on anonymity, instructing Eleanor to provide no details beyond the fact that her tuition had been covered. As he hung up the phone, a weight lifted from his shoulders. It wasn't just about gratitude anymore, it was about recognizing the spark he'd seen in her, the intelligence and determination that had shifted the trajectory of his own life. She deserved a chance to focus on her potential without the constant burden of financial strain. Weeks later, as the summer faded into the crisp beginnings of autumn, Claire walked into the bursar's office with a familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach. The semester was about to begin, and she'd been bracing herself for another round of payment negotiations. She approached the desk, her folder of documents clutched tightly in her hands. I'm here to discuss my payment plan for the semester, she said, her voice steady but tinged with the weariness of repetition. The clerk typed her name into the system, her eyebrows lifting as she read the screen. Oh, there's no need. Your tuition has already been paid in full. Claire blinked, unsure if she'd heard correctly. What? Your balance is 0, the clerk repeated, swiveling the monitor slightly to show Claire the confirmation. It looks like an anonymous donor covered everything for the year. Claire stared at the screen, her mind spinning. Anonymous donor? Are you sure? There must be some kind of mistake. No mistake, the clerk said with a warm smile. You're all set. Congratulations. Dazed, Claire left the office and walked back to her dorm, the folder still clutched in her hands though it was no longer necessary. Her thoughts raced as she tried to make sense of it all. Who would do this? Why? When she opened the door to her room, she was greeted by an envelope sitting neatly on her desk. Her name was written on the front in elegant handwriting, and inside was a single piece of paper. Thank you, it read. Beneath the words was a signature she recognized immediately, Donovan. Her breath caught as the pieces fell into place. The yacht, the argument, the laughter, her analysis, everything came rushing back. Somehow, that brief, contentious moment had led to this. She sank onto her bed, the letter trembling in her hands. For years, Claire had questioned the value of her voice. She'd second-guessed herself, wondering if her ideas and efforts mattered in a world that seemed so focused on status and power. But this was proof that they did. She had spoken up, and though she hadn't realized it at the time, her words had rippled outward in ways she couldn't have imagined. As she sat there, a quiet sense of pride washed over her. She didn't know why Donovan had chosen to help her, but she knew what it meant. It meant that her efforts had been seen, her intelligence recognized. And for the first time in a long time, she felt truly validated, not just in her work, but in herself. Claire folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer of her desk. She didn't know if she'd ever see Donovan again, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the knowledge that her voice had made a difference, and that, no matter how small it seemed, it always could. Donovan stood on the sidelines of the park's soccer field, his whistle hanging loosely around his neck. The laughter of children echoed in the air as they darted across the grass, chasing the ball with the kind of uninhibited enthusiasm that only came with youth. He'd been volunteering as a coach at the youth program for 6 months now, and though it was a far cry from the corporate boardrooms where he had once spent all his time, it had become a surprising source of joy. He had stumbled into it almost by accident. It started with a conversation with a colleague about giving back, a simple suggestion that he try something outside of his comfort zone. At first, Donovan had been skeptical. His time was valuable, and volunteering had always seemed like something other people did. But now, as he watched one of the kids score a goal and turn to him with a grin of pure triumph, he felt a warmth he hadn't known he was missing. That warmth had begun to permeate other areas of his life as well. He found himself seeking out connections that weren't built on ambition or status. It was during one of these shifts that he met Sarah, a woman who worked at a local nonprofit. She was unlike anyone he'd known in his corporate world, grounded, empathetic, and unpretentious. Their first conversation had been about books, not business, and her laughter had been like a tonic, peeling back layers of his carefully crafted facade. Their connection grew slowly but steadily, rooted in shared moments rather than grand gestures. She introduced him to a quieter, simpler way of living, one that valued presence over productivity. He, in turn, found himself opening up in ways he never had before, about his doubts, his fears, and even the shameful memory of a yacht cleaner who had once put him in his place. Sarah didn't laugh at his story. She simply smiled and said, "It sounds like she gave you a gift." She was right, of course. Claire's words had been a gift, one that had set him on a path he never would have chosen for himself. The humbling experience had cracked open a door, and through it, he had found a version of himself that valued more than just power and prestige. In the months and years that followed, Donovan continued to grow. His team at work thrived, not because he demanded results, but because he nurtured them, creating an environment where they felt valued. He became a mentor to younger colleagues, guiding them not just in their careers, but in finding balance in their lives. The corporate world hadn't changed, but Donovan had, and the change reverberated outward in ways he couldn't have predicted. For Claire, life unfolded with a different rhythm but no less joy. After graduating at the top of her class, she secured a position at a global financial firm where her sharp mind and determination quickly earned her recognition. But it wasn't just her career that flourished. Claire built a life she loved, a home filled with warmth, a partner who respected her independence, and 2 children who inherited her curiosity and tenacity. Every so often, she would think back to that summer on the yacht, to the moment that had set her on this path. She never discovered why Donovan had chosen to help her, and over time, she stopped trying to solve the mystery. It was enough to know that her voice had mattered, that speaking up had changed her life in ways she could never have anticipated. For Donovan, the lessons of that moment lived on in his daily life. As he stood in the park watching his young players cheer and celebrate, he felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the life he had built, but for the small, seemingly insignificant moment that had set it all in motion. The past didn't define him anymore. But it had shaped him, and for that, he would always be thankful. Their paths never crossed again, but the impact of their brief interaction reverberated through both their lives. For Donovan, it was a turning point, a moment that reshaped his understanding of leadership, success, and humanity. For Claire, it was a lifeline that carried her through a storm and set her on a path to greatness. In the end, they remained strangers, connected only by a fleeting encounter that neither would ever forget. And perhaps that was enough, a reminder of the quiet power of respect, humility, and the smallest gestures of kindness.